Hi, my name is Haley, and today I'm going to talk to you all about saline lakebed dust and how it can affect regional air quality and the climate. So you probably don't hear a lot about salt lakes in your day-to-day life, which may lead you to believe that these are either unimportant or uncommon geologic features. On the contrary, saltwater bodies are quite common in arid regions around the world. For example, you may be familiar with the Aral Sea, Lake Ermia, or the Great Salt Lake. And with climate change exacerbating arid conditions that increases the rate of evaporation and land use practices diverting inflow away from these lakes, salt lakes are slowly drying up, leaving behind saline playas, which impact regional air quality and the climate. For example, playas are incredibly efficient dust emitters that can cause increases in particulate matter concentrations, resulting in a decrease in air quality. Dust that's emitted is also generally very bright and highly reflective, which can help block incoming solar radiation, resulting in a cooling effect on the climate. Playas can also affect atmospheric composition, especially saline playas that contain high concentrations of chlorine. These particular playas can participate in the formation of a compound called nitrochloride that, on its own, can affect air quality and climate in a variety of ways. And this compound is what I'm most interested in understanding and what I'm going to focus on in this presentation. But before I get into the specifics of how ClNO2 is formed, I want to briefly discuss the process of ClNO2 formation on dust particles. And in order to do that, I put together a quick animation that I hope will be informative. So ClNO2 formation begins at night with dust particles that have been picked up from saline playas by wind and lofted into the air. As the temperature cools, the relative humidity increases to a point at which the dust particles start absorbing water in a process called deliquescence. And at this point, a layer of water forms around the outside of a particle, and any soluble material, like salts, will start to dissolve. Generally, this process will take place at about 60% relative humidity if the sample is pure halite, which is important to remember for later. The next step involves a compound called dinitrogen pentoxide, or N2O5, which simply put is a compound that is a nighttime reserve of nitrogen oxides that form in areas of high anthropogenic activity. So if the N2O5 comes into contact with the particle, it can react with the various substances in the dust grain. And in ClNO2 research, this is an important process that is referred to as N2O5 uptake, which basically is defined as the fraction of N2O5 that is reacted on a particle. If chlorine is present, the N2O5 will react to form ClNO2. And this is another important process that is referred to as ClNO2 yield, which is defined as the fraction of reacted N2O5 that actually forms ClNO2. So in this animation, for example, the ClNO2 yield would be 1, since all of the N2O5 that is reacted goes to ClNO2 formation. So once ClNO2 forms, it will diffuse out of the water layer into the troposphere, and it'll accumulate over the course of the night. At sunrise, the ClNO2 photolyzes into a chlorine radical and an NO2 molecule. And this chlorine radical is where we see the effects on air quality and climate. For example, the species can lead to the formation of tropospheric ozone, which is a criteria air pollutant that diminishes air quality and also a greenhouse gas that traps outgoing radiation. Chlorine radicals can also lead to the formation of secondary organic aerosols, which increase particulate matter concentrations, and as I mentioned before, this decreases air quality. Finally, chlorine radicals can increase methane oxidation, which diminishes the lifetime of this greenhouse gas. So now we have an idea of how ClNO2 forms and why we care about it so much. But now I want to get into some of the research that has been studied on this molecule. So recent research has already shown that ClNO2 can form from playa dust, as I described in the last slide. But as straightforward as the process seems, it's still poorly understood. This is a figure from a recent paper showing that playa dust reacted with N2O5 does produce ClNO2. The gray bars in the figure represent the mass percent of chloride calculated in different playa dust samples, while the dots represent the ClNO2 yield, or the amount of ClNO2 produced from a playa sample. And the color of each dot corresponds to the relative humidity that the ClNO2 values were determined at. So if you think about this figure a little bit, there are a few weird things that jump out. So first of all, most ClNO2 research focuses only on halite or sodium chloride as the primary source of chlorine. And as I mentioned, halite only deliquesces at about 60% RH. And you need the particle to be deliquesced in order to form ClNO2, but in this figure, we see ClNO2 produced at relative humidities as low as 15%. You would also expect that the more chlorine in a sample, the higher the ClNO2 production, but you don't really see that here either. There are some samples with high chlorine content but low ClNO2 yield, and vice versa, samples with low ClNO2 yields and high chlorine content. So the conclusion here is that our understanding of the relationship between particle composition and ClNO2 production is still poorly understood, which brings me to the goal of this study, which is to determine the controlling mechanisms affecting N2O5 uptake and ClNO2 production on playa dust. In order to conduct this research, we analyzed the same samples studied in the Matrou et al. Paper, which included 8 samples from 7 playas in the southwestern United States. And what we really wanted to understand was what the samples were made of and how the chemical composition of these samples were distributed in a particle. So we performed 2 bulk chemical analyses, including ion chromatography, or IC, which measures the bulk soluble content of a sample, as well as X-ray diffraction, which tells us the bulk mineralogy of a sample. We also performed single particle techniques, which in this case preferentially detected material on the surface of a particle. And these techniques included scanning electron microscopy, coupled with energy dispersive spectroscopy, which measures the surface elemental composition of individual particles, as well as single particle aerosol mass spectrometry, or SPMS, which measures surface chemical composition. So the first finding that I want to discuss questions whether or not halite is actually the most important source of chlorine for ClNO2 formation. So on the screen here, you see an SEM EDS figure, which shows an image and the elemental composition of a particle. And what you can see in this spectrum is that chlorine and sodium are both present, which we assume means that the dominant chlorine-containing mineral in this particle is halite or NaCl. Now, as expected, it was fairly common to find indications of NaCl like this in our samples. However, we also saw indicators of other chlorine-containing minerals as well. So in this spectra here, you can see that chlorine is present, but sodium is not, which suggests that there are other chlorine-containing minerals besides halite in this particular particle. So to figure out how much of an impact these halite particles and these other chlorine-containing mineral particles had on ClNO2 formation, we plotted the percentage of each type of particle found in each sample against their corresponding ClNO2 yields at 30% RH, which remember is below the DRH of halite. And what we found is that there is little to no relationship between halite-containing particles and ClNO2 yields. However, there's a very strong relationship between these other chlorine-containing minerals and ClNO2. Now, this category of minerals can include things like fischivite or calcium chloride-containing minerals, which are incredibly hygroscopic and can deliquesce at very low relative humidities. So our takeaway from this data is that at low RH, highly hygroscopic chlorine-containing minerals facilitate ClNO2 formation rather than halite. So to transition into my next point, I want to call attention to this sample here, which represents data from the Black Rock sample. And you can notice that in this plot, it's a bit of an outlier. It has a high percentage of chlorine particles with no sodium, but its ClNO2 yield is rather low. And we can explain this as well if we look at the mineralogy of the sample. So here we have the mineralogical content of the Black Rock playa, and on the far left, there is a peak representing 10 angstrom clays. Now, 10 angstrom clays are a category of clay minerals including illite and muscovite, and have been shown to be highly efficient at consuming N2O5. And based on this past research, as well as findings from Matrou et al. And our own SEM EDS analysis, we hypothesized that the clays might be outcompeting chlorine for N2O5, which would explain why the sample could have a high chlorine content but low ClNO2 production. So in order to figure out if this was actually happening, we plotted the N2O5 uptake and ClNO2 yield values for each sample against their corresponding 10 angstrom clay mass percent from XRD analysis. And what you can see here is that there's a direct relationship between N2O5 and the clays, but an inverse relationship between ClNO2 and these minerals as well. And this suggests that our hypothesis is correct and that clay minerals are actually outcompeting chlorine for N2O5, which diminishes ClNO2 formation. So finally, I want to discuss where ClNO2 formation occurs on a particle. And this is especially important to understand because current parameterizations used in air quality models only rely on bulk chemical data. So here we have a plot relating ClNO2 yields to chlorine from ion chromatography analysis. And you can see from this plot alone that the relationship between the two doesn't seem very strong. However, if you compare this to our SPMS results, which preferentially detects material on the surface of a particle, you can see that there are much clearer trends. And these trends can be explained by the other findings that we made during this study. So the presence of highly hygroscopic minerals and other than halite means that high concentrations of halite aren't necessary to produce high ClNO2 yields. While the presence of competing constituents can result in high concentrations of halite with lower than expected ClNO2 yields. And as mentioned, the black rock sample contains clay minerals that outcompete chlorine for N2O5. We also found that the Salton Sea sample contained a high concentration of organic matter, which previous research has already shown can impede N2O5 uptake and suppress ClNO2 production. So based on this comparison, it seems that surface analytical techniques are more effective at predicting ClNO2 yields than bulk analytical techniques, which implies that ClNO2 formation actually occurs on the surface of a particle rather than in the bulk of a particle. So to wrap up, in this study, we found that highly hygroscopic chlorine-containing minerals are actually more important for ClNO2 formation at low relative humidity than halite is. We also found that our sample contained competing chemical constituents like organics and clays, which can impede the reaction between N2O5 and chlorine. Finally, we determined that ClNO2 formation occurs on the surface of a particle rather than in the bulk of a particle. Now, in general, we found that contrary to metrics used in traditional parameterizations, liquid water content and bulk chlorine content are not the only factors affecting ClNO2 formation on playa dust. And these results don't just apply to playa dust either. The materials that we found affect this chemistry are common in many kinds of aerosol systems. Therefore, these findings are not just applicable to this one particular type of aerosol. So with all of that in mind, it's important that current parameterizations and air quality models consider these results in order to more accurately predict ClNO2 formation. Thank you so much for listening. I want to acknowledge all of my co-authors, our funding from NSF, as well as the individuals that helped with sample collection. Thank you.